Welcome to Decode. I'm Kellen Mace, developer advocate at WP Engine, and for my first video on the channel, we're going to be learning all about using gravity forms in headless WordPress projects. We'll start out with a WordPress backend that's running the gravity forms, WP GraphQL, and WP GraphQL for gravity forms plugins, and then we'll see a front-end Next.js application that uses those plugins to query for gravity forms data, render a form to the page, including all of its fields, manage the state as our user interacts with that form, and then ultimately submits the form back to the server and saves that form entry, as well as does error handling. In this front-end project, I'll provide a suite of React components, a custom React hook, and also some helper functions that you would be able to grab and then drop into your own React-based project to have gravity forms just work out of the box, and use that as a starting point to do form submissions on your own projects. Let's kick things off by getting set up locally to work on this project. You'll first need to create a local WordPress site and then install and activate 3 plugins: Gravity Forms, WP GraphQL, and WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms. After that, we'll be ready to clone down and set up our front-end Next.js application. So this is the repository for the front-end Next.js app. If you clone this down to your computer and then go ahead and open that in a code editor, we can move on to the next step, and that is creating a .env.local file. So right here in the root of the project, go ahead and create a file with this name, .env.local. Then we'll need to define one variable here. So name it next public WordPress API URL, just like that. And then swap out this domain here for the domain of your local WordPress site. Heading back to the command line, we'll then need to run npm install, or otherwise yarn if you use yarn, to install all the project dependencies. At that point, we should finally be able to run npm run dev to get our front-end Next.js app up and running. Once the server has started, we'll be able to visit localhost 3000 and see the Welcome to Next.js homepage. The one last configuration step we need to do is to import a gravity form for us to actually work with. So we'll head back to the WordPress admin now, and I'll go to Forms and Import Export. From here, we can select Import Forms and then choose Files. Inside of the front-end Next.js app repo that you clone down, you'll find this JSON file here. We'll need to select that, go to Open, and then click the import button to tell Gravity Forms to import this form. Once the form has been imported, we can go to Forms and then Forms here in the sidebar, and we'll find our imported form on the list. So here it is, questionnaire. For me, this was imported as the form with ID of 4, but for you, that ID may be something different. Just note what that is, because we'll need to plug that ID in somewhere else in just a moment. I'll click through to this form just so we can take a look at it. And you can see these are the fields that we'll end up querying and displaying in our front-end React application, and then ultimately submitting back to the server with values for all of these and storing it as an entry. Next, let's see if we can get this form rendering out on the front end in our Next.js application. So I'll head back over to our front-end code base and open up the Pages directory. You'll notice that in addition to the index file for the homepage, we also have this questionnaire.tsx file. So we'll open that up and take a look. We'll see that on the questionnaire page, we call the Next.js getStaticProps function, and then inside of that, we call an asynchronous getGravityForm function, and then pass in a number. And this number here represents the ID of the gravity form that we're interested in. So for me, that was 4 when I imported mine, but for you, just enter whatever the ID was of the gravity form that you had imported. Well, once that's done, this function gets the form data and returns that as a prop, and ultimately that's what gets passed into this questionnaire component and used to render the gravity form, which we'll walk through in a few minutes here. So just with that change, you should be able to save that file. And then back in your front-end application, let's try to visit that questionnaire route. You should see a form in all of its barely styled glory. Looks something like this. And this is the form that was imported. If you head back to the WordPress admin, you can see that this form if we go to settings here, it's called questionnaire, and it says, we want to know all about you. Please answer the questions below. In our front end app, we're pulling that text through here. So we're destructuring this form and pulling out the title and description and displaying those in an H1 and paragraph. So that's where these things come from. And then after that, we're rendering this gravity form component and passing all of the form data to it. And it is taking care of rendering out the fields, as well as submissions and error handling and all the other things that we'll get into in this lesson. Now, before we dive too deeply into how our front-end application does things, let's first understand how querying for a form works in the first place. So to do that, we can head over to the WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms code repo here. In the README, there's some documentation. So I'll go ahead and click through to querying forms and entries, and you can see there's an example query here. This plugin provides this Gravity Forms form field here, and you can pass in the ID of the form that you'd like to get, and then proceed to tell GraphQL what data you would like back about that form. So in this case, we should see the form ID, any CSS classes, and then this is where we get into each of the individual form fields. So for each of those nodes, we're getting some data for all of them, regardless of the type of field. But then after that, we have this ... on syntax. So we tell GraphQL for fields that are of this type, our text fields, this is the data that I want back. Otherwise, for any fields that are of this type, that are checkboxes, I want these fields, or name fields, I want these, and so on. And we can go ahead and test a query like this right from the WordPress admin. So let's do that next. In my WordPress admin, I will head to GraphQL and then Graphical IDE right here. And you can see that I've composed a very similar query. So I'm using the same Gravity Forms form field here, and then passing an ID 4, which was the ID of the Gravity form that I had imported. So for you, you could swap out, this ID here with the ID of the form that you had, and then click the play icon to fire off this query. So you can see the data I get back. I'm getting data about any text fields and also about any select fields. So you can see here's a select, and the data I asked for is coming back in the response. That's great, and here are a few text fields as well. But I have a bunch of blank objects here, and that's because those are fields of other types. In our front-end app, we'll make sure to account for all possibilities, so we're getting the data back for all of our types of fields. So with that knowledge, let's head back to our front-end app and see how it's doing this querying for Gravity Forms. So here in the front-end app, we'll go ahead and track down this getGravityForm function that seems to be doing all this fetching magic for us. So that lives inside of Utilities and Gravity Forms. So I'll open the Utilities folder and then find that Gravity Forms file right here. So here you can see is a familiar query, similar to the one that we just fired off. This one we're passing into it the form ID and then specifying the data that we want back for the form. Further down, we'll find that function. So here's the getGravityForm function that we're using in our questionnaire page. So here it accepts the form ID, and then it uses Apollo Client's client.query function and passes through the query getForm, which is this big query that we've built up at the top here, as well as the particular form ID that we're interested in fetching. It awaits that response, and then when the result comes back, it drills down to just the form data and then finally returns that. So that's why here in the questionnaire, we see that after the promise resolves, we are getting the form data, and then we can pass that through to our page component. Heading back to this Gravity Forms file one more time, we can see the data that we're getting for each field and see that it's not listed here. Instead, we have this ... syntax followed by the name of a GraphQL fragment. So rather than what we were doing here, we were just hard coding, exactly the fields that we want at this level. Instead, what we're doing here is importing from each of our individual field components this GraphQL fragment, and then we're interpolating those fragments into this tagged template literal that we're building up right here, and then we're making use of those fields. So just for an example, let's click through to the address field component for a brief second. So take a look at this in more detail later, but for now, let's just pay attention to this top section. So what we're saying is for address fields, we're defining the data requirements right here. We're saying for, it's a GraphQL fragment, and on this type, the address field type, we're defining a fragment called address field fields. And we're saying, this is all the data that we want back. And then down in our component, we're actually pulling out that data and making use of it here. But this fragment that we built up, that's what actually gets exported for every individual field and then used. So for address field, we're getting that fragment and then injecting it here. We're saying, spread all of those fields that we got at this point, use that fragment, and then the same for checkboxes, the same for dates, and so on. The reason the code is architected this way is for code co-location. So we could have just hard-coded all of these fields here and just had a big giant query, but then things would feel a bit disconnected. As I'm in this file, if I'm working on my address field component and I decide, oh, you know what, I actually need some additional data from GraphQL, instead of having to leave this file and go somewhere else to figure out, where those fields are being defined, instead, all I have to do is make the changes right here in this GraphQL fragment and then call it a day. So now that we have an understanding of how all of our data fetching is working to get our form data, let's head back to questionnaire and see how the form data that ultimately gets passed into our questionnaire page component is actually rendered out on the page and ends up looking like this in our front-end application. So here, as I mentioned before, we render this gravity form component and then pass through to it the form data. So I'll click through to that component and we'll look at that one next. So this gravity form component, you can see it's pretty simple. It wraps another component in this gravity form provider, and then inside of that, it calls gravity forms form and just passes through the same prop. So in our case, that's just the form data. This provider we'll look at in just a few minutes, so don't worry about that for now. Let's keep following this trail for now, and we'll click through to this gravity forms form component. And you see that this one is the one that is ultimately responsible for rendering out the form itself. So we open up a form HTML tag, and then inside of that, we have a few things. So we are mapping over each of the form fields that exist, and for each of those, we're rendering a gravity forms field component, which we'll look at in a moment. And then just a few other things. We're saying if we have any errors to display, render those to the page, and then the submit button as well. If this form has any custom text, which ours does, it'll display that. Otherwise, it just falls back to the word submit right there. This component also has a submit handler. So when the user actually is done working with the form and clicks that submit questionnaire button, this is our function that handles the submission process. So you can see that in here, what we're ultimately doing is calling this submit form function that Apollo client gives to us after we call use mutation and pass in the mutation that we'd like to run, which is defined at the top of the file here. So submit form, you can see it accepts the form ID that we're trying to submit the form entry for, and then all of the field values. So we pass in those two things and then call the submit gravity forms form mutation that the WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms plugin provides to us, and try to submit the form. If it's successful, we'll get an entry ID back, and then we'll have no errors. Otherwise, if there was some error with submitting the form, then entry ID will be null, and we will have errors right here. So we handle both of those cases in this component. So heading back to our submit handler, you can see that when we call submit form, we're passing through the two variables that it expects. We're taking the form ID for this particular form, and then all of the field values that we had built up as the user worked through this form. We're passing those through to it as well. So with that, let's look at how we're rendering each individual field with this gravity forms field component. So I'll click through to that component and we'll take a look. So here you can see that we're importing quite a few things. Inside of this gravity forms fields folder right here, we have components representing each type of field that our front-end app is supporting. And then this component is really little more than a switch statement. We're just saying switch on this field's type. So field.type, and then depending on what that is, render something different. So if it's an address field, render our address component. If it's checkbox, render that. Date, render date, and so on down the list through all of our supported fields. And then the default case is if we encounter some field that isn't supported by a front-end app, instead we just fall back to rendering out a paragraph tag just saying field type not supported. So you would see that here if somebody attempted to use this with a field that wasn't supported here. From there, we can click through to see some of these individual field components. So let's start with the simple one. We can just take a look at just like the single line text component here. So I'll click through to that. And all these field components follow a similar pattern where they, at the top of the file, they define their data requirements. And then below that, we have the component, all of the field components except two things, the field data, and then this field errors array as well, which represents any field validation errors that happen for this particular field. And then from there, the actual field gets rendered out. So we just have a wrapper div, a label, and then the actual text input right here. So a single line text field for us would look like this one here. This how dare you field ultimately looks like that when it gets rendered out. For the value and then the on change, these are both coming from this use gravity form hook. And we haven't talked about this yet, so we'll touch on how we're doing state management for this form. So when this hook is called, it provides the current state of this form that the user is working through, and then based on that, we're able to pull out this particular field's value, and ultimately pass that in as the current value for this input. And then whenever the user enters something, if a keystroke happens, we then call this onChange handler. It takes the event and then calls the dispatch function given to us by the use gravity form hook. And it says the type of action that we want to dispatch is this one, update text field value, and then it passes through the field value in the shape that this particular field is expected. So to see what I mean by that, let's head back to the WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms documentation. All right, so here, if we head to the Submit a Form section, and then specifically this subsection using Submit Gravity Forms form, if we click through to that, you'll see that for different types of fields, we need to put our data in a different shape. So for single line text values, it looks like this. So it's ID value, and that value is a string. So that's why if you check this dispatch here, we're putting in that same shape. We're saying ID and then value. Other types of fields have a different shape though. So like a multi-select, its value would be values, plural, and it'd be an array of strings. Address values has something quite different where it actually has these keys here representing the different parts of the user's address and so on. So as you look through these field-specific components, you'll see that the dispatch looks slightly different, particularly what's inside of the field value here. It'll follow the shape that's needed for that particular field. All right, so with all of that, let's head back now and see how this state management is happening. So we'll take a look at where this use gravity form hook is defined, and also this gravity form provider that we saw a moment ago. Let's head over to the hooks folder, and then inside of that, take a look at the use gravity form file. If you scroll down a bit, you'll see right here, this is where the gravity forms provider is defined. And inside of this, you can see that we're using React's use reducer hook. We're passing into it our reducer that we'd like to use, as well as a default state, which for us is just an empty array. And then we're getting back from use reducer both the state and the dispatch. And those are ultimately passed down and used in each of our individual field components to get the current state of that field value, as well as dispatch actions to update the state when the user makes changes. So with that, let's take a look at this reducer, because that's where all the logic occurs for actually making these state updates. So if we scroll up a bit, you can see where that is defined. So here's our reducer. It receives the current state and then the action that's being fired off. And then from there, it runs a switch statement on the type of action and then does something different depending on the case. So let's say it was an address field value. If the thing that was fired off, the action fired off, was of this type, so we head up here to our action types object and just find, the one with that key right there. If it matches that string, then here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull out of the action the field value properties, namely the ID and then the address values. And then we're going to return all other field values, which is provided by this little helper function here. And then we're going to spread those into a new array and then append to the end of it a new one. So that is the ID of this field and then the new address values that were passed in for this field. And ultimately that gets returned and that becomes our new state. So something similar happens for checkbox values, but with subtle differences. You can see that that this is called checkbox values right here rather than address values like it was there. The same would be true for email, and multi-select, it would have a different name and so on. You'll notice toward the bottom we have a bunch grouped together, and that's because all of these actually happen to have the same key. So for all of these simple single input fields, they're all just called value, and they're all a single string of text. So that's why we're able to lump these all together and just say, if it's any of these types, go ahead and pull off ID value and then use that as the field's new value. So now that we have a good understanding of how we can query for form data, render out our form, and then also manage the state as the user interacts with it, next let's actually use this app and see how we can submit forms to our backend. So I'll head back to the questionnaire page of my front-end application here, and let's try to submit an entry. First, I'll pop open the DevTools here, and just to see our state as it updates, what we can actually do is inside of our provider, we can log this state. So let's head over to our form and we'll input some values. So you can see here in the console, I have state, which is being initialized to an empty array, and then we'll interact with our form and trigger some updates. So I'll fill in some text in a couple of these fields. We'll specify our favorite Ninja Turtles, pick a date, scenarios in which we would eat green eggs and ham, and then a few other fields as well. Like that. All right, so that's it for now. I won't fill out all of them, but just with those, I've updated several fields. And you can see now that we have done that, we have an updated state, and here we have the IDs for all of the fields that were updated, and then the values. So some of these are simple strings of text. Others are more complex, so like the name field here, we have first, middle, and prefix pulling through. For checkbox values, we have an array of strings, array of objects actually with strings inside. All right, but as mentioned before, this data is all in the shape required for our mutation to actually submit the form. So let's try to do that now. I will, from the bottom of the form, hit submit questionnaire, and we'll remember, let's see, this is the one where I said this one for the street address, let's say. So we'll hit submit questionnaire, and you can see we have the browser's validation is kicking in here and saying, oh, this field is marked required, and you actually didn't fill out anything. So we'll do that. We'll enter a few characters there, and now go ahead and try to submit it. And there we go. So our form has disappeared now, and we get the confirmation thank you message. So thanks for contacting us. We'll get in touch with you shortly. And this comes from the settings for that particular Gravity form. This is what was set up as the confirmation message to display. So from there, I should be able to head to my WordPress backend and go to Forms and then Entries here and see our new entry on the list. So here it is, this one. So that's the one I had entered. And if I click through to that, you'll see that here's all of the data that the user had entered and being successfully saved to our backend. Next, let's talk about error handling. So you saw briefly, we have some built-in validation that the browser was doing, saying, oh, there's a required field and you didn't fill it out. You better go ahead and do that. We have a few different types of errors we need to handle in addition to that, though. So let's take a look at how those work. I'll go ahead and reload this page just so we can get our form displaying again. And we'll talk about a few other types of errors. So one is if there's an error with the request itself. So an example would be if the user's network connection drops out all of a sudden, and we're unable to submit the form for that reason. If our WordPress backend, something's going wrong with it and it's returning like a 500 internal server error or something like that is going on. If this particular form requires the user to be logged in and they don't have the right permissions, if that kind of thing happens, if any of those happen, Apollo is going to provide an error for us and we can display it in some red text at the bottom of this form. So let's take a look at where that happens. So I'll head to Gravity Forms form, and this is where we actually fire off the submit form mutation, and then from Apollo we get back the data from that, whether or not we're loading, and then the error. And this is the error we're concerned with in terms of our error handling. And you can see further down the page we use that. We say if we have an error, then go ahead and have this p tag here and display error.message. So let's see how that works. So what I'll do is in the DevTools here, I will set it to offline mode. So if the user, had gone offline, for example, and they've filled out everything, even the required fields like this. Now, if they try to submit that, you'll see right away I get a failed to fetch message going on here. So Apollo client, sees that there's no network connection available, and it returns an error response, and then we render it to the page right here so the user knows what happened. So instead of failed to fetch, you could choose to display something different, or like I mentioned, this could be another message like sent back from your WordPress backend if something went wrong, saving that form. So that's one kind of validation. Let's talk about validating individual form fields though, because in Gravity Forms, when you create a form and you add a field to it, you can mark it as required, and then some fields have additional things that you can specify as constraints or as things that need to be validated. So for example, I have this text field right here, says short strings only. I've made this one required, which as we saw, that got caught, when I tried to submit the form without that. In addition though, I have this maximum characters of 5 set there. So this is supposed to be a string that is 5 or less characters. And if you pass in something else, then that error needs to be caught and then shown to the user. So we'll see how that works as well. So I'll reload our form, and here we'll do something that fails validation. So this is supposed to be 5 or less characters, but let's go ahead and enter quite a few more. So we'll enter something like that, and we'll be able to submit this, and then the server will realize that one of the field values is invalid, and it'll send back an error. So I'll hit submit questionnaire, and you can see what happens. The text entered exceeds the maximum number of characters. So whatever field fails validation, a red error message will be displayed directly below that. So when we click the submit questionnaire button, this mutation was fired off, submit form, and then when the response came back, this is what we were given. So entry ID is null, and then we get an errors array back saying, for field 15, there was an issue, and the message is this. So this is where that text is coming from, and that's what we actually pass through. So when we map over each of our fields, in addition to the data about that field, we also pass through the field errors on that particular field, so the user knows, oh, my form wasn't submitted, and the reason for that is something was wrong with this field in particular, and they can read this error text to find out why. Next, let's learn a bit about which Gravity Forms fields are supported when using this approach. So I'll head over to the WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms repo again, and in the README, under the Submit a Form section here, you can see the documentation that we've looked at before for submitting a form, and the example here with these field values. But I will tell you that not all fields work. So WP GraphQL for Gravity Forms supports a number of fields, but only some of those work if you're using this Submit Gravity Forms form mutation. If you want to be able to use more than the ones that this supports, which would include all of the ones in our project, plus maybe one or two more, there is an alternate way of submitting forms, and it's a bit more complex. You have to fire off one mutation to create a draft form entry, fire off additional mutations to update your draft, and then finally one mutation to submit your draft and turn it into a permanent entry. So it's a bit more of a complex, multi-step process to do that. And the reason that that's required for other fields is because of this line here. This is an interim solution until the GraphQL spec adds support for input unions. So because GraphQL itself doesn't have support for input unions, we can't support all the fields using this mutation. So just know that there's another way of submitting forms. And if you read further down in the README, you can see that alternative approach. For this lesson though, and for our code base, we're keeping things as simple as possible and using this single mutation to do our submissions. So with that knowledge that not all Gravity forms are supported here, you might think to yourself, well, how can I limit it so that in the WordPress admin, my content creators can only choose from the supported fields? So to do that, I wrote a plugin here called Gravity Forms Fields Allow List. This is a very simple one file plugin here, just with an attached README. And it says how to modify the list of allowed fields inside of the PHP file and include the fields the field types that you want to be displayed in the WordPress admin, and then install and activate the plugin. And that's about it. So if you crack open this PHP file, you'll see right at the top, we just have this list of allowed fields. So I've included all of those that our front-end project supports. So that'd be this list here matches this list. And then the rest of the code here just takes care of limiting those in the WordPress admin to just these. So let's see what that looks like. So here in the admin, if one of my content creators is editing this form, they have all of these fields at their disposal that aren't actually supported, all these post fields and pricing fields and so on. Their front-end app isn't set up to accommodate. So one way we can limit those is by using this plugin. So let's see what that looks like. I'll head over to plugins and I'll activate Gravity Forms Fields Allow List. I'll hit activate. And now that that's activated, we can head back over to forms and then edit our questionnaire. And you'll see that now we just have standard fields, all supported ones there, and then under advanced fields, all of our supported ones there. So please feel free to modify and use that plugin for your purposes if that's helpful. Next, let's touch on a few things that aren't supported by our current implementation. This code is meant to be a starting point, but it doesn't cover everything that Gravity Forms does on a traditional monolithic WordPress site on the front end of a site. So one example of that would be client-side validation. I showed that when I submitted our form, this error gets caught, 5 characters or less, but we had to actually send the request to the server, and we had to have our backend respond with that error message to display it to the user. What you could do with this code is enhance things so that if rules like that are set, you could catch that on the client. When the user has entered more than 5 characters, you could know that ahead of time and display that error text to them even before attempting to submit the form in the first place. But that's not wired up right now. Right now we have the browser's built-in validation. So if a field is required and it's empty, that would be caught. And also do validation on does an email field contain a valid email address, or a telephone field contain a valid phone number. Things like that we get for free from the browser, but any client-side validation that you would want to happen beyond that, that's not wired up at this point. So you need to code that up in order to add support for those things. Another thing I'll mention is conditional logic. So if I select a field and then head over to conditional logic here in the admin, one of the benefits of using Gravity Forms is you can create these rules and say, that certain fields should only be shown if some other field on the page has, a certain value and so on. But you wouldn't have support for this with our current implementation of our front-end app. So all of this is possible. You can query for all this conditional logic data via GraphQL and then include all of that logic in your front-end app. But with our simplified implementation here, we're not doing any conditional logic support at this point. So with all that, now let's answer the question, how can I use this code in my projects? This code is meant to be a starting point, as I said, so it provides you with the basics for querying for a Gravity form, rendering it and all of its fields to the page, managing the state as the user interacts with it, and then ultimately submitting the form back to the server, and also doing error handling and displaying those errors to the user. And you can leverage all of that if you'd like to in your own React-based projects by grabbing some of the files in this project and copying and pasting them over to yours. So let's see which ones we need to grab. So back in our code base here, if you wanted to leverage this functionality, what you would need to do is copy inside of utilities. You need to get the gravityforms.tsx file. And that's the one that queries for our form data. Inside of hooks, you need to grab use gravity form. That's the one responsible for managing the state as the user interacts with the form. And then you need to grab all of the components inside of the components folder. So that would be gravity form, gravity forms form, gravity forms field, and then the whole folder containing all of the supported field types here. Once you've done that, if you grabbed all of those files, then in your project, you would be able to create a new page. In my case, it was questionnaire.tsx, but you could just drop in, whatever page you'd like here. And then inside of get static props, you would be able to call this function, get the form data, and then pass that into your page component and just render this single component and have everything else taken care of for you. So with that, we'll wrap things up. I hope this video was really helpful and that you have a good sense of how to query for Gravity Forms data and render that form to the page, manage the state as the user interacts with it, and then save those form submissions back to the WordPress backend. And you're able to leverage the code in this example front-end project in your own projects as a starting point to do form submissions using Gravity Forms. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.